Welcome back to Freedom Fridays. We're glad that you tuned in again. Last week, we talked about why does evil exist? If God is all-powerful, if God is all-knowing, and He knows what's going to happen ahead of time, then why does He allow evil to exist? We talked a little bit about that last time. If you want to get that podcast is still available. That's episode number 2, Why Does God Allow Evil to Exist? This one, we're going to continue that study and take a look at some other reasons why God may allow evil to exist. Again, I do not know exactly God's reasons for anything. That is only in the mind of God. No person could ever know that. That's just like you trying to know my motives without asking me or something of that nature. But we can see by His Word some of the reasons that what we call evil may exist. Now, sometimes we title evil as not necessarily something that the Bible would title evil. Many times when people say, why does evil exist? They're thinking of things that are negative in their viewpoint, whether it's natural disasters or whether it's things that people get hurt from or bad things that happen in life, that sort of thing. And sometimes it's actual evil where it's against God's word, against God's commandments, where people get killed and such. And let's think about this. Sometimes bad things happen, hard things happen, because God is judging. We do things that are wrong, we do things that are against Him, and there are consequences for that. When we look in the Old Testament, Israel found God's judgment and went off into captivity in Babylon. The northern tribes got taken up into Assyria because they decided they didn't want to serve God anymore. They decided that they were going to go against Him and that they were going to ignore His ways and they were going to ignore His warnings. And so they ended up in Babylon and in Assyria, respectively, because of God's judgment. Now, people would call that bad. Bad things happened. People died. Evil things happened. Why did that happen? Well, because God was pronouncing judgment on the nation of Israel. Not only does God pronounce judgment sometimes and the effects of our sin, but sometimes it's discipline. The scripture tells us that we are His children who are believers in Him, and because of that, He disciplines us. Just like when my children were younger, I had to discipline them in various different forms when they did something that was inappropriate or when they did something that was downright wrong. I had to discipline them to try and teach them this is wrong, that's right. I had to discipline them to hope that that would change their actions and change the outcome of what they were doing to be something that should have been what they were doing. Which leads me to the next reason, and that's correction, which is implied in discipline, in true discipline. It's not punishment, that's more judgment. But the discipline that I'm talking about is more correction. You want to see a change. And God does that when He wants to see a change in us sometimes. We find that sometimes we're headed the wrong direction and we need a nudge. Sometimes we need more than a nudge. Sometimes we need a slap. Sometimes, as we say, we need the proverbial 2x4 upside the noggin in order to get us in the right place. And sometimes bad things happen for the purpose of correction. I'd like to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12 for another reason why bad things might happen in the world. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And I'm going to start in verse 7. Paul is speaking here, and he says, "So to keep me from becoming conceited, because of the surpassing greatness of the revelations, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited." Now, this thorn in the flesh that Paul had was a bad thing. It was a hard thing. We don't know exactly what it was. Some people surmise that it was his eyes and the issue with his eyes that came from the light on the road to Damascus. Some people think that maybe it is a temptation that Paul struggles with. Either way, it's a hard thing. In verse 8, he says, "3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly for my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong." Paul here is equating whatever his thorn in the flesh is and however that made him weak. He's equating this in the last verse with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. Those are the very things that many people have in mind when they ask the question, how can bad things happen if God is all-knowing? How come he allows these bad things happen to people who are his people? Well, Paul was clearly one of God's people, one of God's most faithful. And he says, for the sake of Christ, I'm content with all that, because when I'm weak, God gets the glory. This is God's way to show off, because even though I'm having a hard time, God can come through and he can show off. Now let me continue here that some things in our lives, some of the reasons that God may have calamity or troubles or difficulties come into our lives is because a lot of times those things draw us toward God. When you look at 9/11, that was a time when many people were drawn to God because of the hardships happening in our nation and because of that around the world. It drew many people to look for a better answer than what they had before. And that answer is God. That answer is Jesus Christ. Sometimes things drive us to God. And you may say, well, does that justify God doing those things in order to bring us back to him? Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a right thing to do. Just like when I discipline my children to draw them back to what's right to do. Some things help us to help others. Now, I've gone through some things in my life, and my wife has gone through some things in her life that we don't like, but those things in our lives can help us to understand other people and to help other people that are going through those things. So sometimes things happen in our lives so that we can relate to other people and so that we can show them the grace of God. We can show them his love, his mercy, his truth, that they can actually get through this with his help. One of the things we tend to do is fixate on the problem, fixate on the difficulty. But instead of fixating on the difficulty, I'm going to challenge you instead to focus more on what might God be telling me through this. Is there something in my life that I need to change? If not, what might God be using this for in my life? Is this an opportunity that I can use to reach out to other people? Is this something that I need to that God is telling me that I need to know or I need to be able to endure so that I can grow greater virtue and patience in my life, or so that I can grow other virtues in my life. Often, as James says, hardships help us to build character. Many times, most of the time, character is not built without hardships. It's kind of like when you're a bodybuilder, and clearly I'm not, but when you're a bodybuilder, you have to work hard and put those muscles through strain and stress and pain in order for them to grow, in order for them to get stronger. Well, that's true with all of life. In order for us to get stronger, we need to go through difficulties. So sometimes we need to go through difficulties. We know that God has a purpose. Often we don't understand it. But really, God has a purpose, and we don't need to understand it. As long as He understands it, and He's got it, and He's got all of this taken care of, and He sees the other side, and He knows this is for our best, then we need to trust Him. And we need to see that He does have this. Let's go to 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. And I'm going to start in verse 6. In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Peter here is agreeing with Paul and saying that the testing of your faith through difficult times and trials in our lives ends up in bringing praise, glory, and honor to Christ, because He gets the glory when things work. It's not just back to me, oh, of course I can handle this. No, it's because God alone could handle it, and so He saw me through, and it's His strength that's seen, not mine, when I'm weak. Let's go to 2 Peter. 2 Peter chapter 2. 2 Peter chapter 2. And I'm going to start in verse 4, but bear with me here. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until judgment. And I'm not necessarily saying your hardship and your trial is because of sin. That's not what Peter is saying here. Although it might be, not necessarily. Verse 5, if He did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when He brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly, if by turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes He condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, and if He rescued righteous Lot, greatly distressed by the sensual conduct of the wicked, for as that righteous man lived among them day after day, he was tormenting his righteous soul over their lawless deeds that he saw and heard, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials, and to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. See, the purpose that He's saying all of this is to say God has judged in the past sin. God has judged evil in the past. And if He's done it so much in the past, verse 9, then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials. Just like He rescued Noah, just like He rescued Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, just like He rescued some of the angels when He cast some into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness, just like that, God knows how to rescue us from trials. See, God isn't all about keeping us from trials. That wouldn't help us grow. That wouldn't, again, as we talked about last time, that wouldn't be a world where we have any sort of free will. We would just be robots. But instead, he says, I will never leave you nor forsake you. I will be there with you through the trials. And he also knows how to keep the unrighteous under punishment until the day of judgment. All rights will be right, all wrongs will be righted on the day of judgment, but not until then.